The leftover summoned the boy with the useless skill aside Amane. Chapter 1. The leftover skill. I hit the stone hard enough to drive the air out of my lungs. Cold spread through my palms first, then my knees, then the rest of me, as if the floor itself were testing what kind of body had fallen onto it. My stomach turned over once, violently, and I caught myself on one hand before I could vomit across polished black stone. A ring of white fire was dying around me. Not welcome, not relief, not anything human and soft. The first thing I felt in that chamber was scrutiny. It came from every direction at once. From the raised seats above, from the armored men lining the outer wall, from the priests in pale robes with gold-threaded sleeves, from the cluster of people who had landed around me in the same impossible moment. Even the silence felt arranged to weigh us. I swallowed against the acid in my throat and lifted my head. The chamber was too large to be a normal room. Pillars thick as towers climbed into shadow. Silverware turned with a file along the walls. Throta and clean lighter hotona leaves, banners, polymail, ritual circles cut into the floor, and seven of us sent up from sharp tools. A man to my right was cursing in a strangled voice. A woman farther ahead had both hands over her mouth, eyes wet and wide. Another guy pushed himself up faster than the rest of us and turned in a slow circle, jaw tight, already measuring exits even though there were none. So, I wasn't alone. That should have helped. It didn't. Because the people looking down at us were not shocked. They were prepared. They had expected us. A trumpet sounded once from somewhere above. Not triumphant. Formal. Sharp enough to slice through the last of the dizziness. Remain where you are, a voice said. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The command carried cleanly through the chamber, practiced and cold. I got one foot under me and stood. 6 others did the same by degrees, wobbling, blinking, clutching at themselves or staring at the place where the white ring had burned across the floor. We looked like survivors from the wrong kind of accident. The people above us looked like clerks waiting for cargo to stop moving. A man descended the steps from the high dais. He wore layered ceremonial robes over mail, which told me enough about the place before he even spoke again. Temple and state, both at once. His face held the sort of careful gravity that had probably impressed a lot of people in rooms where the outcome was already fixed. You stand in the hall of invocation of the kingdom of Halcyon, he said. You have been called across worlds in an hour of grave necessity. No one answered him. I heard breathing. Mine too fast. Someone else trying not to panic. One person starting to ask a question under their breath and killing it halfway through. The robed man let the silence sit for a heartbeat too long. You have been chosen, he continued, to aid this realm against the northern rupture, the escalation of monster tides, and the worsening pressure upon the frontier lines. You will be protected under royal authority. You will be instructed in the customs of this kingdom. In time, you may win distinction, office, land, and honor. It was well delivered. That was the problem. Too well delivered, too shaved, too ready. The promise landed, but it landed on top of what I was already seeing. The soldiers at the perimeter weren't guarding the room from outside threats. They were guarding us. The scribes near the lower steps weren't recording a miracle. They were recording intake. And behind the man in robes, high on the far wall, a carved panel showed figures kneeling before a crowned ruler while shafts of light descended from a circle in the heavens. The summoned figures in the carving were slightly smaller than the king. Not guests. Not equals. Assets made holy by stone and repetition. Someone beside me found their voice first. What the hell is this? The man demanded. Tall, broad-shouldered, already angry enough to hide the fear under it. You kidnapped us. Every head in the room turned toward him. He had the kind of face built for being listened to. Square jaw, straight nose, good posture even after being thrown through worlds. His dark hair had fallen into his eyes, and he shouted back with the irritation of someone accustomed to standing at the center of a room. The official studied him, not with offense but with interest. This summoning was conducted under sovereign sanction and divine observance, he said. That doesn't answer the question. No, the man said evenly. It answers the reality. The broad-shouldered guy's mouth flattened. He wanted to keep pushing. I could see it. But the armored line around us didn't shift, and something in the chamber's air made his anger look less like defiance and more like an early mistake. A woman in a dark coat stepped forward from our group instead. Slim, composed, pale face gone even paler, but her eyes were sharp and awake. If we're expected to fight for you, she said, then you already know what we are, or what you think we are. So stop speaking around it. The official's gaze moved to her. A long breath passed. Then, for the first time, I saw something almost honest reach his face. You have all been called with the potential to receive a marked gift, he said. A singular aptitude, a special skill suited to this age of need. Around the chamber, the tension shifted. That got their attention. Ours and theirs. Somewhere above, a noble in dark blue leaned to murmur to the person beside him. 2 scribes lowered their pens, waiting. A priestess with silver rings threaded through her sleeves watched us as if she'd already sorted us into categories and only wanted confirmation. A special skill. That phrase should have sounded absurd. It did sound absurd, but the room itself made absurd things harder to reject. The burning lamps with no smoke, the circle beneath our feet still giving off the last ghost of white light, the carvings, the robes, the armored guards standing under banners stitched with stars and blades, and a crowned beast I didn't recognize. I didn't believe in any of this. I just didn't have a better explanation. The official turned one gloved hand toward the center of the platform. Thin lines of silver lit beneath the stone. They spread in branching geometry around us, too precise to be natural, too smooth to be chalk or inlay. 7 points flared, one under each of our feet. The air tightened. I felt it in my teeth before I felt it in my skin. The woman in the dark coat took half a step back without meaning to. The broad-shouldered man didn't move at all. I stayed still because I didn't trust the floor enough to make a smarter choice. The official spoke in a language that wasn't English and wasn't anything I'd ever heard, but some part of me caught its rhythm anyway. Frere, maybe. Hola. Something old enough that the difference had stopped mattering. The silver lines rose into light. Not fire. Not exactly. They wound around each of us in thin rotating strands, touching skin without heat, then sinking inward with a pressure that made my vision pulse. My heart slammed once, twice. Something brushed past the inside of my ribs. It was over in an instant, but I had the sickening certainty that if that light had wanted to tear me apart, it could have done it casually. A series of tones rang through the chamber, 7 of them, different pitches, and above each of us, words appeared. They hung in the air in pale gold, sharp and readable as if the room had decided language was optional. The broad-shouldered man looked up first. Sacred sever blade. There was an immediate reaction from the gallery. Not loud, but unmistakable. A wave of approval. Interest sharpened into hunger. The scribe started writing fast. The man himself went still in a different way. Not fear, recognition of value. Another set of words blazed above the woman in the dark coat. Stark-round sorcery. This time the reaction was stronger. Nobles sitting straighter. Priests exchanging glances. Someone above actually laughed once in astonishment, not mocking, just delighted. Then the others. Iron bastion above a thick-set blonde man with heavy hands and a wrestler's neck. Saint Taylor palm above a woman with practical eyes and ash-brown hair tied back in a knot that had mostly survived the summoning. Lightning stride above the lean man who had been scanning the room from the start. Spirit weave above a younger woman with chestnut hair and a face that might have looked soft in another place. Here it just looked tense. And then mine. It appeared a beat later than the rest. Long enough for me to know people had noticed the gap. Aside for one stupid second, I thought there had to be more. A second line, a subtitle, clarification, anything. Nothing came. Just one word hanging above my head in pale gold. Aside, I stared up at it. It was almost worse because it wasn't dramatic. No blaze, no thunder, no sword, saint, storm, crown, or bastion. Just a word that sounded like I had been placed to one side by grammar itself. A murmur spread through the chamber. Not the same murmur as before. Confusion first, then amusement. The official raised a hand and the next part of the ritual took shape over the floor. 7 translucent panels, each formed from light, hovering low enough to be read. The words on them were in the local language for maybe half a second before my mind made an ugly, seamless adjustment and I understood them anyway. Descriptions. Each skill had one. The broad-shouldered man Gareth, I would later learn, read his first. Generates a sanctified severing force through bladed attacks, he said under his breath, as if checking whether it was real. The reaction from the room answered for him. The woman with star-crowned sorcery scanned hers and her face changed by degrees, calculation settling over shock. High-order astral fire conversion, expanded casting structure, enhanced magic efficiency, she murmured. Lydia, then, Lydia Marrow, though I wouldn't hear the full name until later. Iron Bastion made the blonde man's mouth curl. Massive defensive reinforcement, impact resistance, line anchoring. Rent Haver. His expression said the rest before he did. The healer woman Nina Mercer read hers more carefully than the others, lips flattening at the edges. Useful, I guessed, and probably very useful. Lightning stride got a brief nod from the lean man. Owen read, as if the world had confirmed something he had always expected. Spirit Weave made the chestnut-haired girl Mila Hart blink once and read the description twice. Not because it was bad, because it was complicated. Then my panel slid into place in front of me. Allows small additional effects to occur alongside an action. I read it again, then once more, because the first 2 times hadn't improved it. Small additional effects. Alongside an action. That was it. No force multiplier. No element. No blessed edge. No amplified body. No direct category that a room full of soldiers and courtiers would immediately understand. Just a side effect. A tab on. An embarrassing little extra. The first laugh came from somewhere high in the seats, quickly muffled, but too late. A second one answered from the opposite side of the chamber, lower and meaner. Brent Haver glanced at my panel, then at me, then gave a short sound through his nose that wasn't technically laughter and somehow landed worse. "That's rough," he said, "not sympathy. Evaluation." Gareth didn't laugh. He looked at my skill description for half a second, then looked away the way people do when a contest has been settled and no longer deserves attention. Owen's expression thinned into something almost clinical. "Support adjacent," he said. Maybe, Brent echoed, still not bothering to lower his voice. Nina Mercer did not smile. She studied my panel, then my face, and whatever she thought, she kept it to herself. Mila Hart's mouth moved like she had almost smiled because everyone else had, then stopped before it formed properly. Her eyes flicked up to the word above my head and stayed there an instant too long. Lydia Merrow looked at me once, cool and direct, the way a mathematician might look at a value that had complicated the shape of a neat proof. Then she returned to her own panel. That was almost all worse than open mockery. Because it wasn't hatred, it was downgrading. I had seen versions of that look before, in a different world, in safer rooms. Not useful enough. Not worth the best investment. Put him elsewhere. The official allowed the reactions to settle before speaking again. "The gifts shown are not identical in direct force, rarity, or strategic value," he said. No one in the chamber needed that explained. Yet all who are summoned fall under crown protection. Protection. The word drifted down from a height I didn't trust. A set of doors on the side wall opened, and attendants in dark formal wear stepped in carrying trays, water, folded cloth, and tablets for the scribes. Efficient. Organized. Intake after inspection. The broad-shouldered man Gareth accepted water from one of them without taking his eyes off the upper gallery. "Protection in exchange for what?" he asked. The official met his gaze. "Service." There it was, not even hidden. I took the cloth one attendant offered and wiped blood from where I'd bitten the inside of my cheek on impact. My hands were steady enough. That was useful. My stomach had calmed. Also useful. Panic would not improve the situation. Understanding it might. I forced myself to keep looking around instead of staring at the word aside above my head like it might write itself out of pity. The nobles were not all reacting the same way. Some were plainly pleased by the top-tier results. Gareth and Lydia had pulled the center of gravity in the room. Brent was receiving approving nods as well, Iron Bastion landing exactly where a war-minded court would want it. Nina had temple eyes on her now. That mattered. Owen too, in a colder military way. Mila received interest, though less immediate certainty. The two scribes had already reduced the speed of their writing. One noblewoman in green had turned to speak to someone else before my description had finished displaying. A captain near the wall looked at me once and then past me, already thinking about where useless material got stored. I looked back to the far wall instead. The carvings there ran in long vertical bands between the pillars. At first glance they seemed like ritual scenes and victories and kings being blessed. But one band near the edge held something stranger, a line of armored figures in motion, each posed mid-strike or mid-step, and around every single movement, smaller lines branched outward. One thrust became 3 arcs. One raised hand carried rings of symbols at the wrist, elbow, and fingertips. One shield angle seemed to turn an incoming spear aside while the carving also showed 2 following positions at once as if the stone wanted to say the motion contained more than a block. The style was old, older than the rest. The edges worn, shapes less clean. No one else appeared to be looking at it. The official clapped once. Attendants withdrew. "By law and right," he said, "one gift shall be bound to each summoned soul. The registry must now be sealed through claiming order." That pulled every eye back to him. Gareth frowned. Claiming order. The official inclined his head. The displayed gifts are presented to the summoned group as a set. 1 per person. Once claimed, each becomes fixed to the claimant by right. A small shift went through our line. Lydia spoke first. "You mean they are not pre-assigned? They are available within this invocation," he said. "The order of claim determines the final match." For the first time since waking on the stone, the atmosphere among us changed in a way that belonged to us and not the room. It became sharp. 7 people, 7 gifts, not equal. A stupid contest in a deadly place. That much I understood immediately. Brent barked a laugh. "You're kidding." "I am not." "How is order decided?" Owen asked. The official raised one hand. A younger priest stepped forward carrying a lacquered box. He opened it to reveal 7 flat discs marked on one side with symbols. "By the contest of hands," the official said. "A simple choice of sign against sign. The right accepts chance where status is absent." For a second I thought I had mistranslated it in my own head. Then Gareth actually stared at him. "You're deciding this with rock, paper, scissors?" The official's face did not move. "The tradition predates your phrasing," he said. "Was yes." Brent gave a disbelieving grin. Someone above laughed again, this time because the absurdity had crossed a line too strange even for nobles. I should have hated the whole thing on principle. Maybe I did, but outrage wasn't the part of me that won out. It was the colder part. Of course it would be something trivial. That made a kind of cruel sense. If the kingdom wanted the right's result to look impartial, chance was cleaner than preference. No one could accuse the court of rigging selection order if fools from another world threw hand signs at one another under holy witness. Never mind that the kingdom had built the room, owned the soldiers, controlled the record, and would distribute us afterward according to skill quality anyway. A fair-looking insult still counted as administration. The contest began. We were arranged in a line before the central seal, attendants stepping in to note names as we gave them. One by one, they wrote them down in the local script and, beneath it, in letters I could actually read, Berith Voss, Lydia Marrow, Brent Haver, Nina Mercer, Owen Red, Mila Hart, Evan Cross. Seeing my own name on a foreign tablet made me feel briefly less real than the glowing words above us. The rules were simple, pairings by lot. Winners advanced until the claim order was set. A child could have run it. That didn't make my pulse any calmer. Gareth beat Brent in the first throw. Stone against scissors. Brent swore once under his breath and grinned anyway. Lydia beat Nina without reacting at all. Owen beat Mila. That left me against Gareth in the next round to determine first place. He looked at me once before the throw, not cruelly, just with the practical awareness that my existence affected his odds only insofar as it got him closer to the skill he wanted. We threw. He won. Paper over stone. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. I didn't. Gareth Voss claimed first place. He stepped to the seal as if he'd been expected there all along. Sacred sever blade, he said. The words above him flared and collapsed into his body in a white gold line that ran from brow to hand. He inhaled sharply. The nearest priests bowed their heads. The nobles did not hide their satisfaction. Second place went to Lydia. She took star-crown sorcery, and a colder light gathered around her fingers before sinking into her skin. When she opened her eyes again, they seemed focused on some inner structure the rest of us couldn't see. Third went to Brent, who took Iron Bastion with a visible pulse of dense bronze light around his frame. He rolled one shoulder after testing himself and smiled like a man hearing armor lock into place beneath his flesh. Fourth and fifth followed. Nina accepted Saint Healer Palm, and the priest's attention on her sharpened at once. Owen took lightning stride and barely moved, but the air around his boots crackled once with a thin blue snap. Mila and I were left. That, more than anything before it, hollowed out the center of my chest. Not because I'd expected to rank high. I hadn't. Not really. But there had still been a stupid, stubborn part of me holding out for chance to lurch in a kinder direction. For one upset. One lucky break. One moment where I reached before the room had decided what I was worth. Instead I had slid, step by ordinary step, to the end. Mila looked at me then. Not triumphant. Not smug. Uneasy. The last two gifts remained suspended between us in light. Spirit Weave aside, the contrast was almost theatrical. Spirit Weave's description was broad, difficult, and obviously valuable in the hands of someone smart. Spiritual threads, barrier shaping, detection, layered perception. Not as flashy as a blade or a star-crowned storm, but the kind of thing armies and scholars and tacticians would all find uses for. My panel still looked like an afterthought. Allows small additional effects to occur alongside an action. Even the sentence seemed to apologize for itself. The official turned to Mila first. Mila Hart, he said. Flame. She let out a breath she had probably been holding since the contest began. Spirit Weave. Soft green-white strands rose around her wrists and vanished. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. Relief, real and immediate. Then guilt followed it onto her face before she could hide it. Because now only one remained. No ceremony could make that dignified. No language could fix what was about to happen. The official looked at me. Evan Cross. 6 pairs of summoned eyes, 1 room of nobles, priests, officers, and scribes, all watching to see how I would wear being last. I stepped forward because standing still would have looked weaker. The seal beneath my feet lit in pale silver. The final word hovered in front of me. Aside, I heard Brent snort from behind my left shoulder. Someone in the gallery didn't bother muffling their amusement this time. A nobleman's voice drifted down, careless and clear enough to catch. Then the scrap takes the scrap. Heat touched the back of my neck. Not rage. Something meaner because it had nowhere clean to go. I made myself read the description one final time, all the way through, as if careful attention could wring more worth from it. Allows small additional effects to occur alongside an action. Small, additional, alongside, every word cut. I could have refused, maybe. I thought about it for exactly the length of one heartbeat. Then the room answered the thought for me. The guards, the scribes, the officials' patience, the carved summoned figures kneeling on the wall. The way protection had sounded when he said it. The fact that this right had not brought us here to negotiate. Refusal would not send me home. It would only make me a problem before I had any idea what problems cost in this world. So I straightened, kept my voice level, and said, aside, nothing dramatic happened. No thunder, no chorus, no beautiful flood of light. A thin pale line brushed the center of my chest, spread to my shoulders and hands, and disappeared so quietly that for a stupid instant I wondered whether the ritual had failed to bind at all. Then a prickling ran through my fingers. But that was it. The hall remained a hall. The nobles remained nobles. The soldiers remained soldiers. I remained the man who had come last. The official signaled the scribes. The registry is sealed. Just like that, it was done. Whatever chance had existed in the room had already passed and hardened into record. Attendants escorted us from the central seal to a lower chamber lined with tables, water basins, and more officials. We were separated, measured, questioned, noted. Names, age, prior profession, injuries, handedness, ability with weapons, illnesses, level of literacy. It was so mundane that it made the summoning worse. Miracle on the floor. Inventory at the desk. I answered what I could. Office work, mostly, from a world that would never understand. Some recreational training with a wooden sword and a club that liked old fencing styles more than it liked results. Running, repetition, not a soldier, not a genius. Healthy enough, right-handed. The scribe taking my answers wrote quickly until we reached the skill line. There he slowed. Aside, he repeated, Des, observed manifestation? None yet. His pen paused only a fraction. Long enough. Then he wrote something in the margin. I couldn't read it, but I knew what sort of note it had probably been. Low immediate priority. Support uncertainty. Monitor, minimal. When he was finished, an officer in a dark tabard took me and the others down a corridor lit by narrow windows and wall lamps. The palace or fortress or temple complex, whatever this structure, was at thick stone passageways and floors worn smooth by generations of boots. Everywhere we passed, people already seemed to know what we were. Not heroes. They looked at us the way one looks at weapons being moved under guard. Curious, but only up to the point of function. We were given rooms in the same wing, though not all in the same tier. That, too, said enough. Gareth, Lydia, Brent, Nina, Owen, Mila, and I were led past the first landing where servants hurried to prepare suites with better furnishings and broader windows. An attendant peeled away with Gareth and Lydia, another with Brent. Nina was taken by a temple functionary who smiled for the first time that day when speaking to her. Owen was shown to a clean upper room with a balcony facing the training courts. Mila hesitated before following the woman assigned to her. Then it was just me and a junior attendant climbing one more narrow stair. No balcony, no broad windows, no rich rugs, carved chests, or polished side tables. My room had a bed, a basin, one narrow slit for a window, a stool, a shelf, and a chest that looked older than I was. Functional, private enough, better than a cell, not by a huge margin. The attendant bowed, not mockingly, just by habit. You will be informed of tomorrow's evaluations at first bell. Evaluations? Physical aptitude, combat suitability, magical responsiveness, instruction assignment. He kept his eyes at the level of my collar, not my face. Meals will be brought for the first days. Right, he lingered as if there might be more. There wasn't. When he left, the latch clicked with a very ordinary sound. I stood in the middle of the room and listened to my own breathing. Then I sat on the edge of the bed and put both hands over my face. Not for long, just long enough to let the day hit all at once. The cold floor, the inspection, the glowing words, the laugh, the noble's scrap takes the scrap. The way Gareth had already begun to rise into the shape expected of him. The way Lydia's eyes had sharpened. The way everyone in the room had understood, faster than I had wanted to, where value pooled and where it did not. I lowered my hands. The room was still the room. Nothing had improved in the space of those 10 seconds. I knew better than to expect it to. There are moments when you get hurt and some part of you wants to become dramatic about it. To say this is unbearable, this is unjust, this is the part where I break, or rage, or vow revenge so loudly that it covers the quieter truth. The quieter truth came easier to me. This was bad. I had been brought to another world to be used in a war I did not understand. The people in charge had already begun sorting us by utility. Those with obvious strength would be trained, sponsored, displayed, and preserved. Those without it would be protected only as long as that protection was cheaper than disposal. No one had said the last part. No one needed to. I had seen enough systems in both worlds to know how inefficient assets ended up treated once pressure increased. The thought should have sent me into panic. Instead, it tightened something inside me into a hard line. Fine. Then I needed value, not dignity. Dignity was a luxury for people whose position was already safe, not wounded pride, though that burned too. Value, something demonstrable, something measurable. something a room full of officers and priests and nobles couldn't casually decide to let go. The problem, of course, was that my skill looked like garbage. I pushed back from the bed and stood. The room had nothing useful in it except myself, so I started with that. Hands, grip, balance, breath. The prickling had faded, but when I focused, I could still sense a faint wrongness in the edges of my movement, like my body had gained one invisible hinge and no manual. I extended my right hand slowly. Nothing. Closed it, opened it again, turned the wrists. Still nothing. I took one step forward, another. I inhaled, exhaled, let the breath settle lower in the body the way I had been taught long ago in a practice hall back home by a man who cared more about repetition than talent. No revelation came. The world did not suddenly explain a side out of pity. A tray arrived with food I barely tasted. Dark bread, a stew heavier on roots than meat, a strip of salted something, water. I ate because I would need the calories if tomorrow involved evaluations, and because self-pity on an empty stomach is louder than it deserves to be. Afterward I lay down for perhaps an hour and stared at the ceiling beams while footsteps passed beyond the corridor wall. At some point laughter drifted faintly from a lower floor. Not cruel, just distant. I rolled over, got up, and left the room. No one stopped me. Maybe summoned outsiders with worthless skills ranked below active concern. The palace courts lay open under the night sky, enclosed by arcades and walls pale under moonlight. One court was occupied by 2 guards drilling with spears. Another stood empty, but for a rack of practice weapons and 3 straw dummies dark with old cuts. The air smelled of stone, lamp oil, and the colder smell that comes after sunset when a place of heat lets it go. I took a wooden sword from the rack. It was balanced poorly compared to what I was used to, heavier at the tip, made for straightforward drilling by people who expected strength to compensate for elegance. Good enough. I moved to the far edge of the court where the guards weren't likely to care what I was doing. Then I started swinging. Nothing clever, just a basic forehand cut. Then, and again. The first 10 were ugly because my shoulders were still stiff from the summoning. The next 20 got cleaner. I set my feet, let the hips turn, tried to feel for the place where intention moved into action and action into result. A sigh allows small additional effects to occur alongside an action. If that was true, then the question wasn't whether the skill looked stupid. It did. The question was whether it did anything at all, and under what conditions. 30 swings. Busy. The guard stopped at some point and watched for a while with the detached boredom of men checking whether a strange dog will evolve as it embarrass itself. I kept going. If there was an activation method, I'd find it. If it reacted to will, I'd test will. If it reacted to rhythm, force, direction, breath, focus, angle, tension, release, then one of those would eventually twitch the wrong part of the lock. Sweat started at the base of my neck. My palms warmed around the grip. I cut low, diagonal, horizontal, one-handed, two-handed, with a forward step, from stillness, exhaling sharply, breathing smooth, eyes open, eyes narrowed, thinking of the word, not thinking of it, trying to push something through the motion, trying not to, nothing. I changed to thrusts, then to simple footwork with the sword held in guard, step, recover, to advance, retreat. I don't know how long I worked. Long enough for the moon to shift past the line of the arcade roof. Long enough for one set of guards to be replaced by another. Long enough for my shoulders to start burning and for the humiliation of the day to become less a sharp stab and more a dense weight packed behind the sternum. That was almost useful. Pain can be information if you don't waste it. My right forearm tightened first, then the left side of my back. I loosened the grip before it could poison the rest of the movement. Recover. The wooden blade hissed through the night air. On one of those swings I couldn't have said which number the motion felt fractionally wrong. Not in my body. In the air. I stopped so fast the tip dipped. The guards at the far end looked over. I reset my stance. Sweat cooled on my ribs under the borrowed shirt they'd given me. My pulse thudded in both wrists. I cut again. Same line. Same speed. Nothing. Once more. Nothing. I exhaled through my teeth and repeated the exact angle I thought I'd used the first time. The wooden blade sliced down, and a breath after the strike should have ended. The air in front of it gave the faintest nudge. Not a shockwave. Not force worth naming in front of anyone sane. A tiny push, so small I might have dismissed it if I hadn't been waiting like a starving man over crumbs. The nearest straw at the practice line shivered, just barely. I stared at it. The guard on the far end squinted, probably wondering why a man with a practice sword had frozen in place like he'd seen a ghost. I moved closer to the straw dummy and touched it. Nothing on the surface. No cut, no split, but the hanging bundle was still swaying, and I knew exactly how hard a wooden sword swing should have moved air from that distance. Not that. I stepped back, heart pounding now for a different reason. Then I repeated this swing, this time slower on the setup, cleaner through the hips, attention narrowed to the end of the action. The strike finished. A heartbeat later, the same faint secondary shove brushed outward from the path of the blade. Embarrassingly weak. Real. Something in me went very still. Not relief. Relief would have been too soft for what the day had made of me. This was smaller and harder and much more dangerous. Because the skill worked. Because the description, pathetic as it was, had told the truth. A small additional effect alongside an action. Small enough for a noble to laugh at. Small enough that no one in that hall would have called it power. But real. I looked down at the wooden sword in my hand. The grain caught moonlight along one edge. My fingers trembled once, not from fear, but from the sudden pressure of a possibility so narrow it could have vanished if I breathed on it wrong. A weak push trailing a strike. Worthless in a hall full of sacred blades, astral sorcery, fortress body reinforcement, holy healing, lightning movement, and spirit thread perception. Maybe, or maybe not. Not yet. I raised the practice sword again. The guard nearest me called over, half amused. You planning to hack that dummy apart before dawn? I glanced at him. Not tonight, I said. Then I turned back, settled my stance, and swung again, hunting the tiny second motion in the dark as if my life had already started depending on it. Chapter 2. Repetition. In the dark I swung again. The wooden blade cut down through moonlit air, stopped where it should have stopped, and then, a breath later, the faint extra shove brushed outward from the line of the strike. It was still so weak it would have been laughable if I had shown it to anyone in a court. I swung again anyway. The tiny push didn't appear every time. That made it worse and better at once. Worse, because inconsistency is the ugliest kind of weakness. Better, because inconsistency meant there was a condition inside the motion, and conditions could be learned. I reset my feet and repeated the same cut until my shoulders burned. The palace court had gone quiet again. The guards had stopped watching me with curiosity and returned to their own half-muted conversation, which suited me. I didn't need witnesses while I was trying to understand whether the most humiliating skill in the kingdom could do anything worth surviving on. The next push came on the 11th try. Not stronger, cleaner. The edge of the air shifted against the straw dummy from half a pace farther than the wooden sword itself could have touched. The bundle trembled once, then settled. I stared at it long enough that my forearms started to shake from holding guard too rigidly. I lowered the blade and tried to strip the motion apart in my head. Not magic in the dramatic sense. No chant, no sign, no flash. The extra effect had come only after I committed fully to the swing, not before. Not during the setup. At the end of the action, or just behind it, alongside an action, the description had said. Maybe that also meant dependent on it. I tried throwing the push without swinging. Nothing. I tried making the swing deliberately small and forcing intent into the end of it. Nothing. I tried a full committed cut with no attention paid to the supposed secondary effect, just clean mechanics and full follow-through. The weak shove appeared again. That told me more than the failures had. The skill didn't seem to care whether I dramatized it. It responded better when the primary action was real, not imagined, not requested politely. Done. I breathed out, slow and controlled, and changed the drill. Step in, cut, recover, step out, cut again. If a side worked by attaching something to a completed action, then movement should matter too. The description was broad enough to be insulting, but broad meant room. Not much, maybe almost none. Still room. The first hour taught me nothing except that I could keep going longer than my hands wanted to. The second hour gave me scraps. A weak push after a committed forehand. Sometimes after a diagonal cut. Never after a thrust, at least not one done straight. Once when I stepped in too hard and nearly overbalanced, I felt a strange correcting drag at my hips, as though the motion itself had quietly shaved an inch off the mistake. That one I couldn't reproduce. I worked until sweat had soaked the back of my shirt and dried there, until my grip skin felt raw, until the moon had tilted west and the practice sword seemed to have gained weight for no reason except fatigue. Finally, I stopped and put one hand against the straw dummy. No visible damage. No miracle. But it had moved when it should not have moved. More than once. I laughed once under my breath. It didn't sound happy. Then I set the wooden sword on my shoulder and started walking the length of the yard in slow lines, back and forth, trying movement without the blade. Stuff, Rhea, stuff, Rhea. At first it was just recovery, a way to keep the legs loose while the arms rested. Then the rhythm changed under me, not dramatically. The ground did not answer. No light appeared. But after several passes I noticed that when I matched the breath deliberately to the stride, inhale over 2 steps, exhale over 2, keep the shoulders quiet, let the ribs widen instead of lifting, the fatigue in my chest stop climbing as fast. That by itself could have been normal training economy. I knew the difference. This felt assisted slightly. The way a poorly balanced door can still swing easier if it catches the hinge just right. I lengthened the path, adding half turns at each end of the yard. The effect held. Not enough to make a tired man fresh. Not enough to turn labor into ease. Just a subtle smoothing of breath and body when I moved with intent and let the breathing ride beside the step instead of after it. Another small additional effect alongside an action. I stopped walking and stood there in the moonlight, chest rising and falling, and understood two things at the same time. First, this skill was real in more than one way. Second, it was exactly as pathetic as everyone thought. A weak trailing push from a sword swing. Slightly steadier breathing while moving. If Gareth Voss could cut through armor with sanctified force, if Lydia Marrow could turn magic into high-order astral fire, then what I had just found would barely earn a footnote. But small things count when the rest of the field is trying to kill you. I lifted the sword again and kept going. By the time the eastern edge of the sky began to gray, I had identified only a few pieces with any confidence. The primary action had to be honest. To me, the secondary effect came after or through it, not instead of it. Trying to force the added effect directly made it less likely, not more. And the more tired I grew, the harder it became to tell the difference between what the skill was doing and what my body merely wanted to believe. I hated that last part. Self-deception gets men buried. When I finally returned the practice blade to the rack, the nearest guard gave me a long look. "You still here?" "Yes." He looked over the court, over the straw dummy, over my shaking hands. "You summon folk are all strange. Only some of us are useful," I said before I could stop myself. The guard's mouth twitched, not with mockery exactly. More like agreement from a man who had seen the way the court sorted people and didn't consider it news. "Then best become the other kind," he said. I went back to my room in the gray before dawn. For a little while I sat on the stool instead of lying down. Sweat cooled on my neck. My forearms throbbed. I tried flexing my fingers and felt a faint buzzing under the skin. Not pain, not cramp. Something closer to overuse with a trace of whatever this world's magic called strain. The danger in that was obvious even with no instruction. If I had been in a familiar training hall back home, I would have marked the point, written it down, adjusted tomorrow's load, and built from there. Here I had no paper yet, no teacher, no idea how hard the new part of me could be pushed before it broke. So I lay down in my clothes and closed my eyes, not trusting sleep enough to truly surrender to it. When the first bell sounded through the palace, I was already awake. The morning was colder than the night had been. Servants moved through the corridor at speed, carrying folded uniforms, towels, trays of food, and sealed tablets. The summoned wing was fully awake now. Footsteps passed on the stairs above and below. Voices, some clipped and formal, some newly confident. An attendant brought me plain training clothes in dark gray and a belt with no insignia. Gareth, when I passed him in the corridor on the way down, was wearing white and blue trimmed with silver. Not ceremonial this time. Official. It suited him too well. He walked with the easy straightness of a man who had slept, recovered, and already begun occupying the role the room had offered him. Two officers trailed half a pace behind, one speaking quietly about the order of assessments and the presence of several knight captains at the central ground. Gareth noticed me because I was in the way. His eyes flicked over my clothes, my face, then my hands. "You look awful," he said. I wasn't sure whether that was insult or observation. "Didn't sleep much." "Should have," he said. "No point wrecking yourself before they even test us." Then he moved past me, already listening to the officer again. There was no malice in it. That somehow made it settle harder. He hadn't meant to put me in my place. He had simply spoken from inside his own assumptions, and in those assumptions I was a lower priority problem. One that could afford mistakes because little was expected of it. At the next landing, Lydia Marrow stood by a window reading a slate while an elderly mage in layered robes explained something about magical attunement standards. Her training clothes were dark with fine gold stitching at the sleeves. She looked as composed as she had in the summoning chamber, maybe more so. Fear had been processed overnight into structure. She glanced at me once, eyes narrowing very slightly at the way I carried my right shoulder. "You overtrained," she said. It was not phrased as a question. "A little." That would be inefficient, so it's stopping. That made her pause. Not because I'd impressed her, more because I'd given an answer that wasn't self-pity and wasn't apology. She closed the slate and looked at me directly for half a second longer. "Only if the method is sound," she said. Then the mage said her name and she turned away. In the dining hall prepared for us, the hierarchy had been arranged into furniture. Not overtly. No one had hung placards reading valuable and expendable. They didn't need to. The larger tables near the windows held the better place settings and drew the attendants first. Gareth, Lydia, Brent, Nina, Owen, and Mila found themselves directed naturally into those seats by a web of tiny decisions no one would have admitted making. A smaller table near the side wall remained. I sat there because pretending not to notice would have been worse. Mila Hart glanced over once while taking her seat among the others. She looked like she wanted to say something and had no idea what would survive saying. In the end, she only gave me a short, awkward nod. I nodded back. Brent Haver was in excellent humor. I tested mine in the room, he was saying to Owen before the food had fully landed. Bed frame lost. You're surprised your first instinct was property damage? Owen said. I am impressed it took until morning, Nina replied without looking up from her cup. That got a laugh from Mila, a small one. Even Lydia's mouth shifted at one corner before smoothing again. Their conversation moved quickly after that, circling around first impressions, controlled demonstrations, what each had felt when the skill bound. Gareth described sacred force running through the blade line. Lydia spoke in cooler terms about structure, conversion, and efficiency. Owen said almost nothing, which in itself suggested confidence. No one asked me what a side had done, not because they were too cruel to ask, because they had already guessed the answer and found it too uninteresting to confirm. I ate everything on the plate anyway. Porridge, eggs, bread, preserved fruit, thick slices of salted meat. Training on no fuel would be stupidity, and I had no margin for stupidity. My body wanted sleep almost as badly as it wanted food, but the moment I stood from the side table, the bell rang for assembly. We were led to the central training ground by different handlers but arrived together. The yard below the palace wall was large enough for a company drill. Sanded practice circles, weapon racks, archery butts, marked running lanes, spell markers set in bronze at even intervals, raised viewing balconies, and a shaded stand where nobles or officers could observe without dirtying their boots. This place had not been improvised for us. Summoning was routine enough here to have architecture. Officers, knights, temple personnel, and court mages already waited in clusters around the ground, more than were necessary for simple testing. The kingdom wanted to see what it had bought. Master-at-arms, mage evaluators, a temple examiner for Nina, 2 scribes for record, and an official I'd seen in the hall the day before, now stripped of ceremony and wearing a dark coat over mail. He spoke first. You will undergo basic demonstrations of movement, physical control, magical responsiveness, and skill manifestation. These results determine instruction track, equipment access, and assignment priority. Assignment priority. The phrase landed where it was meant to. Gareth folded his arms. So again, ranking. Always, said the officer. No one objected after that. There wasn't any point. We began with movement tests. Running lanes first. Time sprints, turns, recovery. Owen Red made the watching officers exchange immediate glances the first time lightning snapped around his feet. He didn't even use the full skill, I think. Just enough to let them know what the ceiling might look like. The result was still absurd. He crossed the line like the yard had shortened for him. Garrett's run came next and wasn't as fast, but he moved with such clean force and such natural athletic authority that 2 knights by the rail started discussing footwork and combat carryover before he'd even finished accelerating. Brent turned out to be slower, but almost impossible to disrupt once moving. When one evaluator added a shove test at the turn marker, Brent barely lost line. Mila was light on her feet, not fast in the same way Owen was, but precise. Nina moved with practical balance. Lydia was not really dominant, and she seemed to observe this other doing it. Then me. I ran on tired legs with a body that had already spent too much of the night under a wooden sword. Not badly, just not memorably. Mid-pack, maybe below. Good enough that no one could label me useless from basic fitness alone. Nowhere near good enough to drag attention back to me on physical metrics. One of the scribes wrote without looking up twice. Then came weapon trials. Gareth took a practice blade and turned the entire yard toward him. He wasn't merely strong. He had presence, the infuriating kind that makes movement look cleaner than it has any right to look. When he invoked Sacred Sever Blade, white brilliance crawled along the edge, and the target post split with a sound that cracked across the training ground. Not shattered. Sever. A controlled, decisive cut. Exactly the kind of demonstration officers dream about presenting to a king. Approval broke out instantly in the viewing stand. Lydia followed in the casting square. Stark round sorcery formed in layered rings above her hand, a geometric bloom of pale gold and deep crimson. Then she drove a focused astral flare into the reinforced target stone and left its surface molten in a circular depression the size of a shield boss. Clean, terrifying efficiency. The mages watching her forgot to hide how excited they were. Brent planted himself in the center ring and let 3 armored trainees hit him from different angles. Iron Bastion answered with a bronze density that thickened around his frame. The strikes landed and failed to move him properly. One of the trainees nearly lost his own grip from the rebound. Nina's test was quieter, but the temple examiners leaned so far forward they nearly gave themselves away. Damaged flesh on a slaughtered animal specimen knitted under her palm with holy warmth that even I could feel from the rail. Mila's spirit weave came out as faint luminous threads spreading from finger to air, forming a delicate barrier mesh and then a sensing sweep that found hidden objects placed around the marker field. Useful in ways that made strategists attentive. Owen's turn sent a line of blue-white force skimming over the sand as he crossed from one target to another faster than the eye wanted to track. Two dummies lost their heads before the first one had finished falling. Then there was me. The officer in charge glanced at his slate. Evan Cross. Skill manifestation. I stepped into the practice circle with a wooden sword in my hand and every useful person's attention already beginning to drift. That did something ugly to the stomach. Not fear of performance exactly. Something meaner. The knowledge that a poor showing would not disappoint them. It would merely confirm their filing. I drew one breath, then another. Committed primary action. The rest after. I chose the cleanest diagonal cut I had. The wooden blade hissed through the air. At the end of the swing, I pushed my awareness toward the edge of the motion without trying to grab the secondary effect by the throat. For a fraction of a heartbeat, the extra shove followed. Weak enough that the hanging target swayed a little more than it should have. One evaluator squinted. Again, he said. I repeated it. No secondary effect. The target moved only as a training sword would move it. A few people in the yard looked away immediately. I forced my grip to loosen and tried again. This time the faint push appeared, but smaller than in the night, probably because 20 pairs of eyes had made me less clean instead of more. The target gave a shiver. The evaluator wrote something. Description matches, he said flatly. Not false, not impressive, merely matched. Any alternate expression? I've noticed slight additional regulation while moving, I said. That got me a brief look from one of the older instructors, more interested than the rest. Demonstrate. I nodded and moved to the running line set beside the ring. Walk, then light jog, pace steady. Breath aligned with footfall. I let the rhythm settle and invited the subtle smoothing I had found in the yard. It came, though faintly, no visible phenomenon, just better control. The instructor stepped beside me for a few strides, listening to my breath with the sort of attention only a veteran or a healer learns. He said. The officer looked up from the slate. Combat significance? Limited at current strength, the instructor replied. Current strength. The wording almost helped. It implied growth was possible. Then he ruined it. Perhaps useful for endurance conditioning or minor support adaptations. Minor support adaptations. I heard Brent's low exhale that might have been a laugh. No one said anything openly cruel. They didn't have to. The tests rolled on. The hierarchy stood there in plain daylight, undeniable and clean. Hero candidates. Specialist assets. Technical support. Peripheral value. I stepped out of the ring and back into line with the others. Gareth had the sort of face men wear when they are already thinking ahead to real drills, better weapons, proper opponents. He gave me a glance that landed somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal. So it does something, he said. Yes, he considered that as if deciding whether the something mattered enough to keep in mind. Then work on consistency. I intend to. He gave one short nod and turned away because his name had been called again. He wasn't mocking me. That might have been the hardest part of the morning. If he had laughed, I could have placed him neatly. Instead, he was simply operating inside a world that had taught him how value looked, and my skill did not look like much. The next stage of testing was controlled application in paired drills. I was not placed with Gareth, Lydia, or Owen. Of course not. Their evaluators were already discussing elite tracks and controlled sparring partners. Brent entered shield line disruption tests. Nino was drawn toward temple personnel. Mila rotated between barrier and perception exercises. I was handed to a middle-aged instructor with scarred knuckles and a face like weathered wood. Basic exchange, he said. Attack, defend, move. Show whether the secondary effect can support actual combat mechanics. He was not unkind. That almost made me wish he were. We began slowly. He cut from high right. I blocked. The jolt traveled into my wrists. By instinct I tried to let the force slide instead of meeting it dead. And for a moment the same strange off-angle feeling from the previous night brushed through the guard to tiny, incomplete, as if my body had nearly found the second line hidden inside the block. The instructor noticed. Do that again. You mean the angle? Whatever that was. We reset. He struck. I blocked and tried not to overreach. This time I felt only the ordinary shock of wood on wood. On the fifth exchange, the contact skidded a hair outward and spared my forearm some of the direct force. Not enough to count as technique yet. Enough to make me pay attention. The instructor's eyes narrowed. You've got something in the defense line too. I think so. Then don't think. Find it. So I did my best. Attack, breathe, recover, block, angle, breathe, step. The yard around us filled with cleaner miracles. Astral fire, holy light, speed too quick to follow. My own world shrank to the ordinary ugliness of trying to make one bad skill reveal one more inch of itself under pressure. When the drill ended, the instructor rubbed at his beard. Nothing battlefield ready, he said to the scribe, but he's got a habit of looking for carryover. The scribe paused. Carryover. Something after the main action. Weak, but deliberate. Deliberate. That word mattered more than the others had. Not enough to raise me, enough to harden the line I was building for myself. We broke briefly at midday. The summoned group were given water and food in a shaded section of the yard while officers continued their discussions at a distance that was supposed to look respectful and only looked tactical. I sat near the edge again because that was where the space opened. Nina Mercer came over with her cup and stopped beside me. "You're pale," she said. "Didn't sleep much." So Gareth was right. I looked up at her. "He said that to you too. He said it to your face in the corridor." She drank, then added, "He wasn't wrong." I almost smiled. Almost. She crouched instead of standing over me, which made the conversation easier to endure. "You're overusing something you don't understand," she said. "I can see it in the tremor along the hands. Can you fix it? Not if you insist on making it worse between every treatment." Her eyes moved once toward the central ground, where Lydia was speaking with 3 mages and an officer while a weapon master gestured through possible support formations. "But I can tell you this much. Whatever your skill does, your body doesn't yet know how to carry it efficiently." I figured. "You say that like figuring is the same as respecting it." I said nothing. That earned me the look I probably deserved. "Be practical, Evan," Nina said. "If they don't value you highly, then you have less margin, not more. Damaging yourself early is exactly how you become disposable." That hit because it was true and because it was spoken plainly, without cruelty. "I know." "Good," she said. Then, after a short pause, "Your skill is weak right now. That's not a moral failure. But if you're going to survive with weak, you better be precise." She rose before I could answer and went back toward the temple examiner waiting for her. Across the yard, Mila Hart was watching one of the barrier drills while absent-mindedly winding a pale thread of spirit weave around 2 fingers. She noticed me looking and glanced away a little too fast. Brent was boasting to a pair of knights about how many regular soldiers it would take to move him once Iron Bastion fully matured. Owen sat alone on an equipment crate, conserving himself even at rest. Gareth was in the middle of a live cutting evaluation, and every strike he made seemed to simplify the world around it. Hit, split, move on. I looked down at my own hands. Tremor, Nina had said. She was right. Fine shaking at the fingertips. Too subtle for some. Not for a healer. Not for me either, now that I stopped pretending. I wrapped my fingers around the water cup until the motion calmed. The afternoon put the difference beyond argument. Real instruction tracks were assigned on the spot, not announced formally, but obvious from where people were led and by whom. Gareth was taken by 2 knight captains and a high temple blade advisor. Lydia went with the court mages. Owen was claimed by military instructors specializing in recon and high-speed engagement. Brent was drawn into defensive corps consultation before he'd even left the yard. Nina went with temple support staff. Mila was kept between magical studies and tactical screening, not ranked at the very top, but certainly valued. I was left with 3 others from lower staff and a quartermaster clerk. Not insulted. Process. The clerk read from a slate without bothering to look moved by the human part of it. Evan Cross. Current assessment. Low output auxiliary skill with uncertain long-term development. Moderate physical potential. Limited immediate strategic value. Recommendation. Transfer to applied field conditioning and frontier utility track. Frontier. The word landed like cold water down the spine. I held his gaze. How soon? Pending transport rotation. Possibly within days. The scarred instructor from earlier, the one who had noticed carryover in my blocking, gave me a brief sideways look. "The Frontier trains quickly," he said. The clerk snorted very slightly. "The Frontier uses quickly." Neither man bothered softening it. I looked past them to the upper terrace where the others were already being separated into their future lanes. Gareth had a real steel training blade in hand now, not wood. Lydia was being shown a set of inscribed rods by a mage with open excitement. Owen had been moved to the long track. Mila stood beside a tactics officer and was listening hard. Nina had temple attendants around her. Brent was laughing. No one looked in my direction. Then Mila did. Only for a second. There was apology in it, or discomfort, or maybe just the ordinary human reluctance to watch someone visibly sorted downward. She did nothing with it, because what was there to do? Walk over and argue with a system she had no power to change, at her own cost, for the man with the embarrassing skill? Of course she didn't. I wouldn't have expected it. The clerk rolled the slate close. "You'll receive travel issue once final orders are sealed. Until then, continued conditioning and basic practical instruction. No advanced weapon allotment without sponsor approval." Understood. He seemed faintly surprised that I answered without protest. There was protest in me. Plenty. But anger wastes itself if it doesn't find a purchase. A sponsor. Advanced weapon allotment. Frontier utility track. Low output auxiliary. The word stacked in my head not as humiliation now, though that remained, but as terrain. Terrain can be crossed. One of the officers nearby called Gareth's name loudly enough for the whole yard to hear. The full skill this time. White light rose along the practice blade. The watching rail leaned forward as one. I turned away before the strike landed. Asterisk. By late afternoon, the palace had already begun releasing the least interesting parts of us from its attention. Not from security. Never that. But from prestige. I was assigned a smaller training court at the rear of the complex with a handful of ordinary recruits, 2 failed lesser nobles on probation, and a grizzled sergeant who introduced himself as Harker and informed us, without flourish, that the palace had sent in everything not yet worth polishing. He looked directly at me when he said it, perhaps because I was the most obvious special case. Then he handed out practice blades and shields and worked us until the sun dropped low. Harker didn't care about ceremony. He cared about foot placement, guard recovery, shoulder alignment, and whether a man froze when struck in the face with wood. That suited me better than admiration would have. I took 3 hard knocks before I adjusted to the rhythm of his drills. The second clipped my temple and filled my left eye with white sparks for a moment. He did not apologize. He nodded once when I reset guard quickly instead of complaining. Again, he said, "So again." By the third cycle my body had become one long list of complaints. Tired from the night, tired from the formal tests, now more tired from basic practical training. That should have been enough. It wasn't, because during a shield drill something happened. Harker struck my guard at an inward angle meant to collapse it. I caught the blow late and wrong, but instead of taking the full force dead through the arm, the contact slid a fraction offline. Only a fraction. Enough that the shield held and my stance did not break completely. It was there and gone in an instant. A tiny adjustment righting the defense. Harker's eyes sharpened. "You did that on purpose?" "Not fully." "Do it fully." "I don't know how yet." "That makes 2 of us," he said. Then he struck again, harder. By the end of the session, I had reproduced the effect 3 times out of perhaps 30 blocks. Not good. Not useless either. The skill was beginning to show a shape. Ugly but consistent in principle. Not power replacing skill. Extra result attached to real action. A bit of push on a strike. A faint improvement to breathing while moving. A slight slip in the angle of a block if timing and structure lined up. Small additional effects alongside an action. Still humiliating. Still, I was starting to think the description had insulted me by honesty rather than by deceit. When Harker dismissed the others, he jerked his head toward the weapon rack. He leaned on a practice spear and studied me in the long orange slant of evening light. "You're one of the summoned." "Yes." "With the weak one." The directness was almost refreshing. "Yes," he grunted. "Then here's the useful truth. Men sent to the frontier with weak, but real tricks either learn exactly what those tricks can do, or they die while guessing. Guessing looks brave from far away. Up close it's just stupid." I said nothing. He seemed to approve of that too. "You got the face of someone who'll grind himself bloody trying to close a gap," he said. "Don't make the common mistake." "What mistake?" "Thinking pain itself counts as progress." That one stayed with me, because it was close enough to the mark to sting. He pointed toward my hands. "Come back tomorrow with less tremor. If you can't manage that, at least lie better." Then he walked off without dismissal, which I took as dismissal anyway. The rear yard emptied. The palace beyond it glowed warm in the upper windows where the high-value lanes would continue into dinner conversations, theoretical instruction, and the sort of early investment that compounds into destiny. Somewhere in there Gareth Voss was probably holding a real blessed sword under supervision. Lydia might already be mapping the internal geometry of her spells. Nina would be under temple protection. Owen under military eyes. Mila under scholars and tacticians. Brent under anyone who liked sturdy walls. I stood in a lesser yard with a practice sword, a splintering shield, and a body Harker had just accused of trying to solve weakness by bleeding at it until it gave way. He was not entirely wrong. I picked up the shield again. One more sequence, I told myself. Just enough to test the slipping block while the feeling remained fresh. Then the sequence became 10. Then footwork with breathing layered in. Then diagonal cuts with a weak push. The sun went down. Servants lit wall lamps. I was dimly aware that I should stop. That my right hand had begun tingling unpleasantly. That my left shoulder was tightening in a way that would punish me tomorrow. I kept going because each repetition gave back a grain of structure, and structure was worth more than comfort. At some point a bell rang from the main palace. Dinner for people whose names were likely being entered into better ledgers than mine. I finished the set and finally lowered the sword. The tingling in my right hand had become a low internal vibration, half numbness, half burn. My breath, strangely, was steadier than it should have been for the amount of work done. Carrying the breathing through the movement again, even without knowing what to call it yet. The skill was helping. Tiny. Real. Too tiny for any officer in that palace to reconsider my track because of it. Not yet. I walked back to the summoned wing after dark, slower this time. The corridor windows showed pieces of the city below the palace walls, lamps strung through streets, distant rooflines, a river reflecting the last ash blue of the sky. Alderving, Halcyon, names I still did not know how to carry naturally in my own head. An attendant was waiting outside my room with a folded bundle and a sealed tablet. Transfer issue, he said. I took both. The bundle contained Retta for clothes, then the palace training set, a heavy travel cloth with a muted word on window and underlayers, durable gloves, and a utility belt with loops for a thing those I did not yet possess. Frontier gear, or close enough. The tablet's seal bore the kingdom's crest. I broke it and unfolded the sheet inside. By order of royal logistics and military necessity, summoned outsider Evan Cross is to be reassigned from Central Priority Instruction to the Eastern Frontier Line, Fort Calder Sector, for field conditioning, practical support deployment, and further evaluation under local command. Departure, second bell after sunrise, 2 days hence. There was more. Equipment limitations, reporting protocol, escort assignment, the legal language of service. I read it all carefully anyway. Fort Calder Sector, field conditioning, practical support deployment, further evaluation under local command, not discarded, not valued, sent where weak utility could be spent cheaply, and if it somehow proved itself, recorded afterward. The attendant shifted his weight, waiting to see whether I would object. Maybe some of the others had. Gareth might have demanded clarification if they had tried to move him. Brent probably would have laughed. Lydia would have negotiated terms from inside the confidence of obvious worth. I folded the order neatly. Understood, I said. The attendant blinked. You'll be briefed tomorrow. He bowed and left. I closed the door behind him and sat on the edge of the bed with the frontier cloak across my knees. The cloth smelled faintly of oil and storage cedar. Functional, durable, not made for display. I pictured the palace yard in daylight again. Sacred sever blade carving clean white force through targets. Star-crowned sorcery melting stone. Lightning stride crossing distance like a cut in the world. Spirit weave finding hidden lines. Saint healer palm mending flesh. Iron bastion taking blows without yielding. Then my own part in it. A target swaying a little more than it should. A breath kept steadier while moving. A block sliding force off the ideal line once in 10, then once in 9, then back to once in 12 when fatigue mudded the feel. Small additional effects alongside an action. I put the order aside, stood up, and reached for the practice blade I'd borrowed back from the rear yard. The room was too small for full cuss, but not too small for stance work. Stuff, breathe, raise guard, let the shoulders settle. One action, and something beside it. If the palace wanted to send me to the frontier because I was not worth polishing, then the frontier would get exactly what it asked for. Not a hero, not a spectacle. A man who would keep picking at the ugly edges of a weak thing until it stopped being easy to dismiss. Outside my narrow window, the palace bells marked the deepening night. Inside the room, I moved through the same short pattern again and again, breathing until the faint extra steadiness returned, until the tingling in my hand sharpened, until sweat gathered beneath the collar despite the cold. By the time I finally stopped, the transfer order still lay folded on the bed where I'd left it. Fort Calder. 2 days. I looked at it once more before extinguishing the lamp. The kingdom had made its judgment. Fine. Then I would take the weak push, the steadier breath, the slipping block, and carry all 3 to the frontier. That was where they sent things they could afford to lose.